Okay. So what we're going to talk about now is a little bit about how to work a bit more effectively with RSpec. Because up until now, we just used the most basic aspect of RSpec, the most basic aspects of RSpec, and RSpecs are becoming very, very long-winded. They have a lot of text and very little content, and it's actually making them a bit less readable. So I want to show you some tricks that you can do with RSpec to make the code a bit more readable, and hopefully to ease some of the pain. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try to refactor a little bit of the current spec that we have. And the first thing that I want to show you is that we have the idea of something called subject. Subject is a special word in RSpec, and it basically defines a shortcut that we can use. By default, the subject is whatever we describe under the describe thing. So if we have used the let so far, right? We said let calc, and then we say string calculator dot new. If we wanted to do that. Well, subject is kind of like that, but it automatically defaults to having this type of code. So we can say subject, if we actually just remove this whole line, we get it by default. So if string calculator didn't have any dependencies, there would be a method subject that referenced an instance of already newed up string calculator for each test. Okay? Now, why is that important? Because the word it and subject can be used synonymously. So you can actually say something like this. I can define subject here and say subject. Let's see. Maybe we can do something a bit more clear. Okay. So if I decide that subject is at the top, I'm going to say subject. It can't be just simple newed up string calculator. So subject is a string calculator dot new with a logger and a web service. Now what's cool about subject is that it is lazily evaluated just when it's called. And we can actually control the values of logger and web service that will be newed up for each subcontext if we want to. So we can go ahead and say that let's let logger to be a fake slow logger. And that means that the logger in here will actually get its value from here. Okay? We can do the same for web service. Web service will be a fake of web service class. So that means that in these 3 lines, we've defined the subject, that is the subject of our test, and its 2 dependencies. Right there in a very, very explicit way. We can try to get rid of this. We don't need calc anymore, but we call it, right? So what we can do instead is we can give a name to our subject and say, let's call it calc from now on. So now it can either be called through it or through subject.something or through calc.something. They all point kind of to the same thing. So here's a context. With a logger, we don't need the mock logger anymore because it's already built in to the string calculator here. Okay? We don't need to instantiate the string calculator. We just need to call add. okay? And we should be able to just call the logger directly and verify. Oh, this is the fake logger. So we should be able to say that logger should have received right. And for now, we can say any args. Any args is a shortcut in Bogus that allows you to basically have any amount of arguments, for example, 2, and if tomorrow it's 3, it still passes, and any value to each parameter. Okay? Let's see. So that becomes a bit shorter. And this allows us to, let's see. Okay, so we get a name error, no such thing as a fake logger, because we deleted the fake logger, some other tests are using it. So that's the error we're getting. It's from another test. It's from line 24, so it's over here. You see this. We don't need fake logger anymore. But this actually passed. Okay, so you see we got rid of a lot of repeating code by having all this happen. Now, if we wanted to, we can say let with, what do you call this? A bang. And this basically tells RSpec that this, the thing inside the curly braces gets executed like a before each test. If you want to run a new instance before each test, because by default, the value is lazily evaluated once and then saved. It's memwise, it's called. It saves the value and then it gives that value to each new test. But the state of the value is the same. It doesn't change over tests. It's almost like it's serializing the value and then giving a value of that serialization to each spec. Anyway, we don't need the fake logger, but we do want to configure the logger here to throw an exception, right? So how do we do that? Well, we can just use another let. And here we can just reset the logger to be called, so let logger to be a fake slow logger with the right method having a proc that raises a BAM string. So what's going to happen now is that this overrides the global logger that we've set and will be injected into this line. So the logger from here is going to be using the logger from here at the context of this. So for that specific context, we can just override the specific inputs into what is basically a function. Okay? So we don't need to tell it that it will throw. We don't need to say new. So we can just say calc.add. And we can say that web service should have received, was it notify? Notify with any args. Yeah, that's right. Notify. So that's taken care of. So now we have this. Maybe it belongs here like this. We can say with the logger that throws, we can put the let right up here so that it's connected to the context. No method error, right, for web service. And this is from line 26. try that again. Line 26 in calc spec. In calc spec. Let's see. So, undefined method write for web service. This is in the rescue part. I might have multiple web service classes here because of the demos, and it's catching the wrong one. But if we only have one, it's usually much easier. Now, what about this context of negative numbers? Let's try to deal a bit with this. Can we make this a bit more readable? What if we said that what if we said all this? For negative numbers, instead of doing that, we can say specify. Specify that you expect, let's see, specify, damn. Let's do that. This is basically the same. So when we don't want to describe with a string, when the string just feels like it's not needed because the text pretty much exemplifies what we want to have, we can just use specify as a shortcut. Okay? And the same here, we can just do that 3 times and have -1 and 2, -1, -1 and -2, and get rid of all these things. So that's starting to look kind of nice, right? I hope.
But how's the output now? How's the message if you write calc at 0, for example?
Sorry?
How's the output if it's failing or if
it's the same output, basically.
like if
It's the same output. It's the same exact thing. When you say it and then a string, it's the same as specifying it without a string. But the expectation is that calc add was supposed to raise an error. Okay?
how does it look in the output?
Should raise exception. That's what it looks like. So it looks a bit less nice.
Yeah.
It definitely looks less nice in terms of a report. And there's always a trade-off with these things. When you stop using the strings, you start relying on the framework to start to parse what it is you're trying to do. There's always a trade-off between the readability of the doc report and the readability of the code, unfortunately. One thing we'll see later in this course is that we can use higher level constructs like Cucumber to have the documentation that we want and still drive these kinds of tests with different ways. But I want you to practice in making things a bit more readable and maintainable in the specs. Now, we're not done yet. This is just an example. Okay, what do we do with a single number? Remember I said that we have that expect that method, right? What if we said that we can say, what if we can do subject just for this context and say the subject is, of course, calc dot add and sorry, what if we said this? Def add input, or let's call it adding. And it just says calc.add input. What if I can say that it or specify adding 2 should equal 2. What if we reset it to 5? What happens? You see expected 5 but got 2. I can now have a much more readable way of saying replace that with 1, expect 1. I can also, of course, specify calc add 2 should equal 2. But I find that this is one step nicer. And I can get rid of that stuff. And now suddenly, context of adding a single number or adding, I can define adding at the top of the describe because it's reusable. Then I can use that. Expect adding like this. I can use that also. I can reuse that. So I can define this at a higher level and move it away and then reuse that so things are more are easier. And then I can, of course, do the same things like here. Handling 2 numbers. Then I can specify 1 and 2 should equal 3. 1, 2, 3 should equal 6. And suddenly the hierarchy is starting to make a bit of sense. So one thing I like doing is that when I describe adding, I define a method called adding, just below it. Okay, and I defined what the action looks like. If tomorrow the action changes, I just need to change it in one place. Okay, but now I can actually say adding 1, and logger should have received. Same thing here. I can do all these things. Okay, and I can just do the same thing here. Okay, it's when you add 1, you should get 1. Now this is actually a more interesting scenario that we haven't discussed yet, and I want you to actually do this. I wanted to add a feature that has a calculator dot last sum. So the feature is that it returns the last sum from the last operation made, or from the last operation made. So I add 1 and then I check last sum. Okay? Now, if I am using subject correctly, I can make things much, much simpler or much, much more readable. I might be able to do something like this. I can define the subject. Actually, the subject is already calculated, right? So I can say let's see. Context. I'm not sure. Okay, I can say that the subject. So here's what I'm trying to do. So I'm thinking out loud how to do this. What I would like to do is to use the special way of using it. So I can write something like this. It or its last sum should equal 1. Now this is a special construct because it is the subject. Whatever is in the subject, I can then assert on things, on attributes of the subject. Make sense? So I can say that subject do. And then I can say calc add 1 and return the calculator. That would make sense for this one, but then I wouldn't be able to have multiple verifications of multiple attributes. I would have to repeat the subject in multiple cases. So it doesn't make sense to use it in this type. But when does it make sense? When a single action changes multiple attributes, right? You create a new person, like the subject is creating a new person, then you might say multiple its. Its first name should equal George. Its last name should equal blah, blah, blah. And each one of them is running in its own little delegate universe. So if one of them fails, the other ones still run. And that's one of the coolest things about it. Okay? So maybe we can just try and do this. Specify that adding. That's interesting. I need to find a way to do this so that there is only one action to do. So I can say, let's define a method that says add and get last sum that says calc.add with input and it returns calc.last sum. So now I can say that add and get last sum should and get last sum of 1 should equal 1. But then I can do the same thing and say when you get back 1 and 2, then the last action sum should be 3. Make sense? I can also say, but what's the default? Specify that, or the default I can say actually, its last sum should by default equal 0 because no action was performed. Make sense? So the last sum should default to something. Then I can get rid of these things. So it's just an example of how you would get around and get rid of things that you don't like. Okay? Here I can say that specify adding an empty string should equal 0. Whoa, I probably messed something up there. I think I removed one too many. Or not enough. We'll figure that out. Yeah. Come on. Okay, never mind. I think you get the idea. I won't bore you with any kind of running errors, but the point is that I want you to try to start to use the idea of subject and let and overriding lets in different places. And what you end up with, hopefully, is something that is much, much more readable. And instead of having the its, you can actually use the its here when they make sense. It calls the web service, and then the web service should have received notify. We can do many different things. For example, we can put the web service in the subject and say that it should have received notify. Okay? As an example, here's what it might look like. This is a different file context with the logger that throws. So let logger do something that throws BAM, make the subject a web service, and then it should have received notified. Okay? Questions? Okay. So before moving on with the rest of the exercises from yesterday, I want you to try to clean up and see, basically play like it's like Play-Doh with the RSpec syntax and see what you end up with, what you like and where you don't like things, which constructs you like, and see if you can clean it up a bit. Okay?